Well, the reason that I've gathered this online cohort of two today is because I've recently read a book, and the book that I read is called The Pastor. I didn't even look to see what year it was released. You might know off your hand,
That's a
Steve,
good
but I think
question.
it was 2000 and oh, look at that. Copyright is
11.
2011. Yeah.
Yep.
So this is essentially the autobiography, one might want to say,
Hmm.
although it's definitely specifically geared towards a certain part of his life, but the autobiography of one Eugene H. Peterson.
Yep.
Now, I have known the name Eugene Peterson for a really long time because when I was a teenager, and this is probably the reason why, if anybody knows the name Eugene Peterson, they know it as well, because I got this, which is
Yeah.
called The Message, right? The Bible remix is actually is how they framed it on this one that I got as a teenager. And it is just like, for me at the time, it like kind of blew my mind because all the stories and all the texts that I had heard growing up, even though I was kind of in an NIV ish church, there was just something about reading it in like real,
Mhm.
raw, understandable language that made it just like the first time I read through the Bible cover to cover was definitely The Message. Now I've
Wow.
come to understand later on in life that you would need to kind of work backwards to understand maybe some of the heart behind or some of the originality of the text, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no question the Message was a hugely
Hmm.
influential book, and I didn't really hear heads or tails of Eugene Peterson until a few years ago, frankly, when I was in a class with you. And you mentioned the name Peterson over and over again. And I got the impression that you might know a little something about Eugene Peterson. So after I
Yeah.
read this book, the first thing I was thinking, I was like, I would love to be able to have Dr. Dunmire sit down and be able to have his brain picked on all things related to Eugene Peterson. So this is your chance. Anything you want to
Awesome.
say about Eugene Peterson?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's interesting. Even the fact that this is called a memoir is there's just a slight little like I think it's unlike a lot of other biographies or autobiographies where he's telling the story, but it's almost like just a bunch of random stories, and he puts them in chronological order. But we get a little glimpse into who his heart is. So actually, the my first introduction to Peterson, I think I had heard his name around the time the message was starting to come out, and it was getting traction, and especially people like Bono were taking notice, which is such a well, when you look at his story and who he is and what matters to him, the fact that he ended up spending time with somebody like Bono is hilarious. There's a story in A Burning in My Bones, which is the authorized biography that came out, I think, in the last year. And there in that biography, they really talk about how he didn't even know who Bono was. They went to the concert, and he went to a YouTube concert. You picture Eugene Peterson, like the Protestant monk, sitting up in a box at a YouTube concert, and yet he found he liked it, and he struck up this relationship with Bono, and partly because he didn't care about celebrity, and they were able to just kind of talk and have confession. So, uh, but the first book I ever read by Peterson was Working the Angles in one of my first seminary classes, and I didn't. It was just another book in the stack, and I devoured it, and I realized there was something about what he was saying, and this is part of a series of 3 or 4 books on pastoral ministry that I've devoured and reread these books over and over again. Um, the way he describes what pastoral ministry can look like, and some of the caricatures of ministry, some of the perversions of ministry, and keeps pulling people back. And you see a lot of this actually in the pastor. I think I've had some people ask me, "Okay, you love Peterson. What's the first Peterson book I should read? If you could only recommend one." And actually, this is the one I usually point them to because there's so many parts of the other books that find their way in here.
Right.
Uh, yeah. So I really cut my teeth on pastoral theology with Eugene Peterson as I was starting out as a pastor. I became a lead pastor at 23, and he was a companion, kind of a mentor to me through his books.
So at 23, you're a lead pastor. I mean, num-
Yeah, yeah,
Eugene Peterson
that
would
was
say
crazy.
numbers don't matter very much, but 23 is a number. That's a number. What was the size of your congregation at the time when you
Yeah.
hopped into that
So,
church?
it was a church on the east side of Buffalo, the inner city of Buffalo, probably the hardest neighborhood city of Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
I was told it was about 40 people, and then got there and it was really like 25 people. And after 6 months, I successfully turned it into 12 people.
All right.
But then gradually we grew up to be a congregation of about 100 people there
Okay.
by the time we were done. But it was, yeah, it was, and it was a setting where I got there at 23, and after 3 weeks, I'd run out of sermons and had to learn how to be a preacher on the job. Yeah.
Yeah, I often tell people like you're speaking of music, your first sermon or two is kind of like the album that you've been working on your whole life, right? So a lot of
Yeah.
people have like their debut album comes out and it's just replete with all this creativity and all sort, and then they realize the next week they need to preach again. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, this is 7 days from now. It's another Sunday. So
Yeah.
same
What do you
with
mean
the
there's
sophomore
another Sunday
album.
coming? Yeah. Yeah.
They call it the
Exactly.
sophomore album slump, where if you're not writing the whole time, you end up running out of material.
Yeah.
So your church, that was your church then. I'm not going to ask how old you are now. That's not important. But you are in a congregation now, which is probably dissimilar in some ways to the one that you started in. So, you want to tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about where you serve now?
Yeah. So I'm the teaching pastor at Watermark Wesleyan Church. We'll be Watermark Wesleyan for another 10 days, changing our name in 10 days. And, but we're a multi-site church at the McKinley campus, which is the original campus. And pre-COVID, we had about 1,800 people here. And the other campuses, we got a couple hundred people at each of those campuses. And so
Okay.
we are the largest Wesleyan church in the area, and one of the major, one of the largest churches here in the Western New York Buffalo area.
Right.
So it's a world of difference coming from where we had been to here.
So that's a big. I mean, anybody in Canada, at least where I am at, is going to just like flat out consider that to be a large church. So as you know, I'm on the east coast of Canada. I'm in Moncton, and where I serve, only God could tell you how many people are a part of our church now, because COVID has made it such that it's kind of indecipherable. But we also, at the end of the day, if you're going to look for an adjective, you're going to probably say big. The church is big. And the reason I wanted to, that is not any kind of self-congratulation. I had nothing to do with it. It's just that I wanted to make sure that we understand that we're talking from contexts of what are essentially kind of larger, if not mega, they're definitely just big churches. And that's important because I get the distinct impression that Jordan, I keep wanting to call him Jordan Peterson because that's another kind of a very different Peterson, the OG Peterson, Eugene Peterson, would kind of be generally disinterested or disinclined towards churches of our size. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in one of his books, I can't remember which one, there's the person in the preface says that he had a conviction that he would never be the pastor of a church larger than one where he could know everybody's name. And Christ the King was a good sized church. They planted that church in Maryland, and it had grown to be, by any measure, a good sized church, but always small enough that he could manage relationships and know everybody and know their names. And I think about it all the time, and I think you and I chatted offline a little bit about how I think it changes the way I go about being a pastor at a church this size, and what some of my core values are, the things I fight for. People and the team here will know, the same way that you heard me talk about Peterson a lot. People hear me quote Peterson all the time, and in terms of the why we do things, the why behind what we do, and the things that are worth fighting for.
Right. Yeah. There's a little section in this book, and I don't know which page it is, but he's kind of near the beginning of his ministry in Maryland. He ends up kind of getting a cohort of pastors, like-minded pastors around. I think they call themselves the company, if I remember correctly. And they kind of there might even be a few rabbis in there. It's quite ecumenical anyway. It's not all just like a mutual society of similar pastors, but pastors that kind of want to have the same kind of ministry, same kind of longevity, same kind of outcome. So it's like a kind of a band of brothers scenario. And after a period of time, one of these people ends up getting a gig. They end up getting a job offer somewhere else to a larger church, apparently a significantly larger church. And Eugene writes him a letter, which is super classic. Like, this was not yesterday, or this was not an email. This is a letter. He writes him a letter. And
even to the end, even to that point, even to the end, he wouldn't get an email address. So even until the time he died, you had to write him a letter if you wanted to write to him, and he would write you a letter back. Really, there's this against the grain tone of so much what Peterson did. But go ahead about this letter.
And that's a theme that I also would like to talk about. But one of one of the things he says in this letter is essentially, actually, I have a few of the quotes here. He says that size is the great depersonalizer.
Yeah.
And then he quotes Soren Kierkegaard. He says, the more people, the less truth. And then he says, what you think is going to be a help, this largeness, is not actually a help, but an impediment. So it's like some pretty scathing language towards kind of like large churches. What sorts of things do you think he's trying to get at? What is it about being? Because the opposite of big is small. If you're going to actually
Yeah.
kind of like antonym the word, so what is it about being small that in some ways is kind of core to the way that he views a congregation?
Yeah, I think it's the depersonalization that gets to him. I think uh, in some of the stories he shares are uh, about the drive behind his denominational leaders towards market research and doing all this kind of marketing to understand what your neighborhood is, and to view people as giving units, or as yeah, I'm trying to think of the exact word for it, but it's really a depersonalization of people that he's really pushing against. Now, I think some people have correctly said it's that size is only the enemy if you're going about it the right way. If you're going about it the wrong way, it's something that he's got this series of books, 5 books that he calls. I think it's in the Pastor that he refers to them as the Peterson Pentateuch. Pentateuch. Christ plays in 10,000 places. Actually, his wife is the one who called them the Peterson Pentateuch, and he kind of laughs at that and shares it because that's funny. But Christ plays in 10,000 places. Eat this book, The Jesus Way, tell it slant, and practice resurrection. And it's really interesting. I think one of the keys for me to understanding part of Peterson's criticism of size and of big churches and that sort of thing, there's kind of hints at it at the end of Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, where he talks about wanting to live a life of congruence, that the way we do things and that the ends don't justify the means, that doing the right thing the wrong way is still doing the wrong thing. And in the Jesus Way, he in the beginning of this book, he talks about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, and his main take on it is that Satan didn't try to tempt Jesus to not be Messiah. He was trying to tempt Jesus to be Messiah in the wrong way. And at the different points, as Satan says, all of this could be yours. Just worship me, and all this could be yours. A lot of people will look at that and say, well, the ends justify the means. If you got to cut this corner, make this sacrifice in order to have all this power and authority, then isn't it worth it to have Jesus in charge? But Jesus won't go about doing the right thing in the wrong way. And he talks about that in the Jesus Way. And so I think if I would, especially in the chair that I am now, if I could sit down with Pastor Pete and say, hey, but what if, what is that number? Are we putting an arbitrary number on it?
What's the actual breaking point of when you go from small to large, or from
Yeah.
good to bad? Like what is it quantifiable? Like, yeah, it's good question.
Yeah, like where is the tipping point? Because is 500 too large for a church? Yeah, and I think there are things that small churches do really well, and I think kind of apart from Peterson, a lot of times small churches criticize large churches as being just focused on numbers, just focused on bricks and mortar, when there's a lot of things that large churches do really, really well in terms of being able to support other ministries. And the number of people who get called into full-time vocational ministries for large churches is pretty high per capita, even compared to the other churches, to smaller churches. But then there are also large churches that are critical in equal and opposite ways of small churches, as if small churches don't care about reaching the lost, as if small churches aren't concerned about excellence. Right. And so I find, especially having been serving in smaller and large churches, that a lot of times we're unfairly judgmental of one another. And I think Peterson is probably a little guilty of that, but I think his main concern is that we're not depersonalizing people, that we're not just treating them like cogs coming through, like widgets coming through the machine, that there's a personalization and that we're not. I think his concern about multi-site would be that it's the McDonaldization of church, or that we're just creating franchises. Whereas if we're what I see, like in our context, what I like most about multi-site is that we're taking the burden. When I was pastor of that church of 20 or 30, I spent so much time just running the church, running, turn on lights and clean up stuff. And whereas our campus pastors, that stuff is handled for them. And they have a larger percentage of their week to focus on being a pastor. I think Peterson would love that. I think where we see churches just becoming cookie cutter mirror images of the main campus, that's where he would bristle and really have a hard time with it. But I think when he sees campus pastors being freed up to really invest in people, that's what's really would matter to him. I think there's a story from Peterson that I know it gets told, and I believe it gets told in the Pastor. I know it was retold in his and a Burning in My Bones, his authorized biography, and I think it gets told in a few other places. And it occurred to me when I heard it come up again in his biography this summer that I thought, this is one of these, it's such a core issue for Peterson. But he's telling a story about being out at a restaurant with a pastor friend. And his friend was having a spiritual conversation with the waitress, talking about the Lord and her spiritual life. And Peterson went up to the bathroom, came back, and the conversation was wrapping up. And after the waitress walked away, the pastor said, "Man, Gene, I wish I could have conversations like this all week long. I wish I could just do this." And he said, "You're a pastor. Why don't you?" He said, "Because I have to run the stupid church." And he didn't use the word stupid. And but that image, the punch in that statement, I think is something we also then see at points in Peterson's life. He tells another great story about pastoral work. Is a book of his about pastoral work is Under the Unpredictable Plant, where he compares pastoral work to the life of Jonah. And he tells a story where he was out so many nights in a row that his daughter, when she was little, asked if he could read her a book that night. And he said, "No, I've got a meeting tonight." And she said, "This is the however many nights in a row that you've been out in a row." And so he went to the meeting that night. He said, "I quit. Throw me overboard." Like Jonah said, "Throw me overboard." And there they made a shift at Christ the King, his church in Bel Air, Maryland, where they ran the church and he was the pastor. And I think that whole idea of running the church and how much time we spend running the church, it would be a real concern to him. It's a concern I have for us and our staff here at a large church. I'm constantly looking at how much time I'm spending in meetings and how long it takes me to schedule a time with a person from the congregation. If we're spending so much time intra-staff sitting around tables and hashing things out, that whole idea of running this stupid church as something that keeps us from doing ministry, that'd be a real concern for Peterson.
Yeah. So much stuff in there. The first thing that I thought of is the song Vertigo by U2. I've never actually thought of the lyrics before, where he says, all of this can be yours, just give me what I want, no one gets hurt. I'm like, maybe that's actually like a Lucifer reference, which is, for heavens knows, it could be just a message version of that whole scene.
U2 has so many of those little references in their music. Bono is he's just kind of dripping scripture throughout their music.
Yeah, that's good. But the thing that really kind of stands out is kind of what you allude to at the end, is the idea that as long as there could be more pastoring, then a church would probably be fine ad infinitum, as long as there's good pastoring happen. And like the very title of the book is The Pastor, right? Yeah. And he talks all throughout about his reluctance to be a pastor, his growing up and having mixed interactions with pastors, his wanting to actually be nested in academia, but eventually finding himself to be a pastor, his marrying somebody who had always foreseen herself as being a spouse of a pastor. That word just, it's like you can't get it. If you did a word count on it, the word cloud would be very large for the word pastor. But when I try to go, and this is a question that I have for you, when I try to reverse analyze what he means by pastor, I have a really hard time fully formulating it. And part of it is because, and we mentioned this before, like I don't have a fantastic handle on what it means to be a a pastor, and I happen to kind of have that in my job description, which of course would, even the sentence that I just made would probably bristle against him, because he thinks you can't have the job of a pastor. It's more of a, but then the lack of clarity in terms of, well, then is a pastor merely a function, or is it some kind of a form? I guess that's ultimately the question that I have, and one that I think kind of plagues our denomination and probably plagues the overwhelming majority of evangelical churches, which is there something kind of like, to use the fanciest words I can think of, ontological? Is there something like about a human, a certain kind of human, that can make them at their core a pastor? Or is it only a function of when somebody is shepherding people? In that case, they are verbally being a pastor. I don't have a good handle on what the clergy actually is in our context.
Yeah.
And so there's actually a quote near the beginning, or it's on page 280 actually. I'll read that really quick, actually. I think that's probably worth it. So he's going through this kind of with his church. A conviction spread through the congregation. This is during like a teaching series. That one of the most soul-damaging phrases that has crept into the Christian vocabulary is, quote, full-time Christian work. So every time that term is used, it drives a wedge of misunderstanding between the way that we pray and the way we work, between the way that we worship and the way that we make a living. So, right, so he kind of goes through this and says, like, hey, at the end of the day, we're all full-time Christian ministers. That's how this works, which is great.
Yeah.
But then what is a pastor? So, Steve, tell me, what is a pastor?
So I'm going to go back to the first book I read by Peterson almost 20 years ago now. And on the second page, not even out of the introduction, I'll read another quote to you from him. Page 2 of this book, Working the Angles. Quote, the pastors of America have metamorphosed. Boy,
it's a big one. Metamorphosized?
Not even metamorphosized.
Oh, no.
I should have picked a different quote. Metamorphosed into a company of shopkeepers.
Nice.
And the shops they keep are churches. They're preoccupied with shopkeepers' concerns, how to keep the customers happy, how to lure customers away from their competitors down the street, how to package the goods in a way that how to package the goods so that the customers will lay out more money. And that image of shopkeepers is a really great contrast of what he says pastors should not be, what the temptation is to be. And then 2 paragraphs down, he says, the biblical fact is that there are no successful churches. There are instead communities of sinners gathered before God week after week in towns and villages all over the world. And he says, pastor, one of the sinners in that group is called pastor and is given responsibility in the community. The pastor's responsibility is to keep the community attentive to God. It is this responsibility that is being abandoned in spades. And so he's contrasting shepherding with shopkeepers. The shopkeepers are worried about, are people happy? Are they giving more? Are we packaging things in a way that keeps them happy? Whereas I think that word attention is huge for Eugene Peterson, the idea of paying attention to God. And I think you even noticed how in his reflections on his own life, that he's just aware of what God was doing at different stages in life, how God was redirecting his steps. And that was, I think, one of his core convictions about what the Christian life is, that the Christian life is, one of the core things is just simply to pay attention, to be aware. You see this a lot in how he and his wife Jan spent their Sabbath, where they would just go out and they'd spend the morning out hiking, just not talking. Talking was out of bounds. They were just paying attention and noticing what was happening in nature. He's also a poet, and I just finished actually reading his book of poetry, and he loved Wendell Berry as a poet, and a lot of his book titles actually are drawn from poems that he loved. And I think one of the things that he would say that poets do for him is they help him to pay attention to the special words to the power of words, to using the right word instead of the wrong word. Right. But that whole idea of paying attention. And so I think one of the things that would be a core conviction of him as a pastor is helping people to pay attention to what God is doing. helping people to notice what God is already up to in their community and their own life, rather than simply packaging things in a way, selling them a slick package that is good for morale.
Right. So somebody can help people pay attention to things, whether we're talking about God or your favorite sports team, I suppose, but probably God would be more relevant to this conversation. People can help, somebody can do that. Somebody can act and be as a pastor without being ordained by a denomination, without having any education, concerted education that we know of whatsoever, without even being officially recognized by the local body at your church. I think of people who do the act of pastoring, like they shepherd, they help point people's attention, just kind of by de facto. They just end up being the kind of person who does that. And you kind of end up saying, you can see, we often call those people, like say, you seem to have a pastoral heart, especially when they have a deep desire for people. Like you can tell that they just have they're truly relational. Does that make them then pastors? The reason I'm kind of getting at this question is the next thing I would like to kind of tug at a little bit is his view of kind of individuality and idiosyncrasy. And when you look at a large church, really the only way for it to be sustainable, and this is, Peterson aside, let's just look at what it means to have a healthy, growing church. It really genuinely means that everybody has to have somebody who's shepherding them.
Yeah.
And one person doesn't shepherd 1,000 people. That's just not how that goes. So there are people who will have to end up filling that void, or you will have people who will just not be led, right? So we look at, usually look at some sort of again, to use a byword, structures or systems, something that will help create a small group, a community group, whatever you want to say, some touch point where they can get into smaller groups. And then we have people who lead those groups. But different churches in different ways will either give a title to or give any sense of responsibility to the people who then end up leading those groups. I would say the overwhelming majority of them probably don't view themselves as pastors, even though they might be doing some pastoring. And so I'm curious to know what, and I mean, you can say what your opinion is or what you perceive Peterson's opinion might be about. I mean, here's somebody who was, as I understand it, was planted by the Presbyterian Church and installed as a pastor. And I think he was there for an awfully long time, moved. Did he ever actually move to another congregation? Or was that really his only full-time congregation that he had there?
That was really the only full-time congregation.
Right.
Then he taught in seminary in Pittsburgh for a little while and then up at Regent.
Right.
But,
so he kind of moved over to full-time teaching. So he was a denominational guy, even though it seems like he was no respecter or deep lover of any particular denomination. I wouldn't say. So what do you think about that? What at the end of the day, it's not just what is pastoring, but what makes somebody a pastor.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the themes that shows up in a lot of Peterson's work is the laity clergy divide, which he really bristled at, where he really rejected the idea of lay people deferring to the expert, of lay people deferring to the clergy as though the clergy do the ministry and we receive the ministry. He's got a book on Leap Over a Wall, which is about David. And one of his points in that book is that David was not clergy. David was a layperson his whole life. And he's an example of a layperson doing things well. I'm deeply moved by his stories about his mother. When he was a kid and she was going into was it mining town or lumber area? Yeah. And she'd go in and as this woman going in with her son, and she'd preach to these giant burly men and rough guys. And even his descriptions of her storytelling. And I love how he says that it wasn't until years later that he realized reading the Bible that the Bible left out all the best parts that his mother had into the story. Yeah. But his stories about her and her genuine ministry as a layperson, and even I think part of his conviction about lay people and clergy is that he wants lay people to see their life as a ministry. that if you're shepherding, it doesn't matter what your title is or what your credentials are. And I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure if you've been paying attention at all to the rise and fall of Mars Hill, that stuff there, but they actually even talked about Peterson recently, the contrast. I think it was Andy Crouch contrasted what was happening at Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll and Eugene Peterson. And that line that gets shared a lot from Mark Driscoll, where he says, there's a pile of bodies behind the Mars Hill bus, and by God's grace, there will be a mountain of them by the time we're done. Eugene Peterson is a pretty gentle guy. I think he might have wanted to come to blows over that word, or over that statement. Nothing could be more anti-Peterson than that sentiment.
Right.
And there, yeah, you're right. So much of shepherding, when you talk about the way we do shepherding with small group leaders, and one person can't shepherd a whole congregation. Like when that church I was pastor on the east side, when we got up to 100 people, I couldn't shepherd everybody in that group. We had to have other people shepherding one another. And you can hide in a church of 25. We had people when we were that small who came and didn't really get ingrained. And here we've got people, some of the most committed Christians I've ever seen in my life, I've seen here serving at this large church.
Right.
And we have people who come and hide.
Sure.
So you can do that anywhere you want to. Yeah. But yeah, to be able to, I think part of the pastor's task is to, as Eugene Peterson would see it, is to be attentive, to be unhurried. In another one of his books, The Contemplative Pastor, I've got a stack of Peterson books that sit next to me, by the way. And The Contemplative Pastor, he says that the word busy should sound to us in front of the word pastor the way that adulterous sounds in front of the word spouse. That to be busy as a pastor is an abandonment of our calling. Because he says so much of what we have to do, you can't hurry through it. You can't run through it at a sprint. And you can't be attentive to people if you've got one foot out the door. They pick up on it.
Yeah.
And
100%. I've been guilty. I have been. That was a really super practical takeaway from this. There's a section in there where he talks about kind of like his schedule and what he does, and I've often gone through bouts in my life where I've looked at margin and realized that if you are cutting it close, and if you have no margin, I mean, finances aside, if you have no margin in your time, like if you literally are like, I got 15 minutes to get to this next meeting and it takes 16 minutes to get there, then you don't have the ability to see what's going on around you. And so it's no way to live. Now, granted, the problem is I feel like in some ways that is a bit of a, how would I say this? It might be almost like a benefit that people who are actually quote unquote full-time vocational ministers have, because you can kind of craft your calendar. Whereas people who are, work a day, like their job is sort of determined for them. There's not as much, they don't have quite as much flexibility, but they do have some. And so like the point is that we're supposed to help model for them in some respects how they could also help model their lives. And so if we're, even with the kind of flexibility that we might have, if we look like we're, super stressed and trying to get to the next thing, then that might somehow inadvertently be communicating that that's how their lives are actually supposed to be. Like we're supposed to be under the gun. But
that's, Peterson writes almost that exact thing someplace in one of his books.
Okay. Yeah, well, he's written enough of them that how could it not be in there somewhere? But
That's right.
He's there's actually one of the things he mentions here is how kind of near the end of his, I don't know how far into his pastoral career, but there's this kind of moving line that he says where he sees that pastor and writer are not kind of two different things, but they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And I didn't take from that he somehow anticipates that everybody who's in pastoral ministry will also have a book deal or will be publishing, but more like writing for him was a way of actually contextualizing the kind of stuff that he was learning in a way that's not just like a one-on-one conversation, but is a little bit more portable, a little bit more macro, kind of working through the actual issues that he's experiencing and that he's seeing people facing. Obviously, he's a prolific writer, but
but to your point though about the busyness, and we do. I think one of the gifts that pastors have we often all decry being quite as busy as we are, and how busy our schedules are, and how many pastors don't truly take a Sabbath. And but one of the gifts that our congregations give us is our time, that we don't have to have another job, that we're able to give unhurried time to things that matter. And he says, to flesh out the rest of what I was just referring to, from the contemplative pastor. He talks about how busy is such a bad modifier for the word pastor. And he says that there are three reasons, or is it two or three reasons why we're busy? The two main ones he shares is that I'm busy because I'm vain, because one of the best ways to look important in our modern age is by being busy. And so, when I go into the doctor's office and I have to wait 15, 20 minutes to go in to see my physician, that's a sign that my doctor's important. And that's why I have to wait for him or her. He says, I'm busy because I'm lazy, because I let other people set my schedule for me, because I let other people tell me what I need to be doing. And so he said that the vanity and laziness of busyness are really striking pictures of why we become that busy. And so he says, okay, if I'm not busy, then what am I doing instead? And he says there's three tasks. I can be a pastor who prays, I can be a pastor who preaches, and I can be a pastor who listens. And he says each of those three things can't be done in a hurry. Preaching takes slow rumination and the time to carefully nuance words and doing the research ahead of time, so that, I always think about it that if I'm preaching to 100 people and I preach for 30 minutes, that all of that time I'm using for all those people, I've got to make that work. And the bigger that group is, the more time I'm using of all these people. And so that takes more preparation on the front end. Prayer, he says, you can't pray and be in a hurry. And like last one, listening. He says, listening is in short supply in the world today. People aren't used to being listened to. And it's amazing how many times, I think he'd be a big proponent of this. Bonhoeffer writes about this too, that Bonhoeffer says one of the best gifts we can give people is just to listen to them, and to ask questions, and just to give people space to share is a huge pastoral gift. It doesn't fit those who want to do the market research and those the entrepreneurial style of pastoral leadership, but it's shepherding.
So. It's funny because near the beginning of his ministry, pretty early actually, there's this. It's funny. It's the 1960s, and there's this person who's a prominent psychologist who dubs it the age of anxiety, and I'm like, man, just wait till the 2020s. I don't know what you're going to call it then, but the age of Ultron is probably we get to that. Yeah. But he's talking about how there's this psychologist who's realizing like they have a more mental health need than they have ability to meet it, and so they recruit a bunch of pastors and try to get them to become essentially, like, instead of being an under shepherd, being an under psychologist, like, or being an under counselor. And he ends up ultimately, after flirting with it and kind of enjoying, frankly, the experience, making a decided break from the idea of being a pastoral counselor. Like, he doesn't want to be somebody who fixes people's problems. He finds that actually kind of an addicting thing, which I think was really interesting, where he basically says, like, it's not about trying to fix their problems, it's about trying to lead them towards their ultimate solution, essentially, right? Which is in Christ. And so it's interesting to think that so many of the people who ultimately end up sometimes seeking counseling, I mean, and there's some like legitimate, like many legitimate reasons why somebody would seek a professional counselor, but also there is a glut, the anti-glut. How about this? There's a glut of people who are in desperate need of just somebody to listen to more than one unbroken sentence from their mouth, just to be able to sit there and really let them process. And so, whether that's somebody who's a licensed therapist, whether that's somebody who's ordained in a church, or whether that happens to be a really good friend that you have who's willing to sit there and not make the conversation be about them, and to just literally sit there and listen and help them and not try to talk about themselves for a few minutes. So if you're listening to this today, maybe that's you. Maybe you're the one who needs to hear this. Next time that your friend has something, don't turn the conversation to be about yourself. Just listen for a little while. Just listen. We're getting close to the end here, and you have been so generous with your time. I I want to just get your take on this because this is something that I've been processing in a number of areas for a while. And you know how like when you buy a blue Chevy and all of a sudden you notice that, my gosh, there's a lot of blue Chevys on the road. And it happened like that because you're attuned to those. So I've been thinking a lot about this hyper individualization of our culture, hyper individualization of not just society, but I think in respects the church as well. So in some ways the church has imbibed this from culture, but in other ways it has actually taken it and it's appropriated it and is now using its own sanctified versions of this individualization. And I don't know how far back it goes. My sense is that it wouldn't be crazy to imply that the Reformation might have had something to do with it. And I'm not talking down the Reformation, just saying. Every force has a lot of unintended consequences. And so here we are 500 years later, and it just feels like the have it your own way religion is not just something that happens outside the church, but it's also something that happens inside the church. And so there's this strand of like kind of freewheelingness that kind of comes out of the 1960s, which carries with us into today. And I noticed a lot of different times in this book where Peterson kind of alludes to, and you've already said it even once during this conversation, like that there's no no form factory way to kind of you use the word widgets, right? You can't just kick out essentially whatever this kind of template version of Christianity is. In some ways, every soul is unique, and therefore every soul needs to be formed uniquely, even though in the end, if we're all supposed to be formed into Christ, there is a unique, but one unique version of where we're going. So, but the first time that it really, I underlined this section on page 171, where he talks about that they're building their first church. They're about to build their first building. So they've been meeting for a few years underground, and already there's this kind of countercultural vibe to their church, right? They're meeting in the basement of their house, and somebody dubs it the catacombs, and it's kind of cool. It's off grid, and they're getting ready to build through their denomination their first building. They've raised some funds, and the denomination sends over a architect, like an expert, and actually they even scare quote the word expert here, which is great. So they end up going away. They're not happy with what the expert suggests for the church because it's cookie cutter. Like it's just like here's the three kind of templates your church can be. You could be this one. You could be this one. Well, we don't want it. We're different, right? We want to be different. And so they reject that architect and they end up looking for somebody else. And so he says here, Alan, who's our denominational supervisor, was not happy with our decision to reject the expert, his term, the expert counsel that had been provided for us. He warned us that we were being very foolish. He used the word headstrong. He'd been through the process dozens of times, essentially. We knew, though, at the end he says, we knew that we were not a set of blueprints. And so I wonder, I mean, as somebody who has read a lot more of his corpus, there is this kind of thread that's running throughout, and you can see it very easily, even the hubris essentially of coming up with the message, which is like I don't know if I don't think he had a translation team. You know what I mean? Like I think this is his work at the end of the day, that most of the time, if you look at like any of the translation, even the NLT is going to have like a team of people who are working on it. But it's his, but because of this, it can actually be his voice, right? This is the way that he interprets the scriptures and the way that he would make it plain to people here and now. So there's just kind of this really like, we're unique, he's unique, we're all unique snowflakeness, which is the most extreme thing I can say, which is not like I really deeply empathize with it, and yet I see what could be the dark side of that kind of hyper individualization often. And so what do you think he would say if I posited that to him? That's a huge thing to say, because I know that you've never met the man, but
you know, one of the things that's really interesting in the authorized biography that came out this summer was how or this year, I read it over the summer, was they said that it shared some stories of students at Regent where he taught, who would come into his office and he was not like this gregarious, outgoing professor, you'd come into his office and he'd just sit there and look at you. so I imagine that if you pushed him on this, he might just look at you and say, well, that's one way of looking at it. But I think that headstrong term, that's absolutely directed at Eugene Peterson. There is an element of him where he's headstrong, where he's maybe a bit of a contrarian. And I think I love part of that about him. Mm-hmm. I love when I go into a church and they've got pictures of local scenery, or, you know, here we're half an hour from Niagara Falls. I love it when I go to a church and there's actually pictures of Niagara Falls, or like not just the standard view, but a unique view, or of parks in our area. We've got a neighboring church that's right near one of the most beautiful county parks, and they've got pictures of their county parks in the men's room. I said, thank you. You know, not just more Thomas Kincaid, nothing against Thomas Kincaid, but you know, so many churches you could plop down and have no idea that you're in a unique geography. So I really love that about Peterson, that, hey, we're not just, this is Bel Air, Maryland. Bel Air, Maryland is different than New Brunswick, which is different than Western New York, and different communities have different personality. But I think there's a bit of a contrarian spirit to Peterson, where he just doesn't go with the flow, mm-hmm. and he was actually really uneasy with the celebrity that the message brought to him, right. And it was a major kind of crisis for him late in his life when he's getting requests for speaking engagements, and people like Bono want to come meet with him, and right. And so when he left Regent to go back to their home front in Montana, he talked about how it was uncomfortable for him. He didn't the celebrity thing that he was so uncomfortable with. When he got to Montana and nobody cared who he was, nobody knew who he was or cared, that was uncomfortable for. He realized how much he'd gotten used to being a little bit of a celebrity, but how good it was for him to not have that on his shoulders, to just be Gene. And but I think there is. I've known some people who are contrarians. I've got a friend who says that when he was in school, his teacher called him Al Yabetsky, because everything was but. And I think Peterson has a little bit of that going on, you know, like, but we need to. I think he would probably drive even the best district superintendent or denominational representative a little crazy. I imagine he'd be a hard person to have as a staff member, but also maybe one of the most important people to have as a staff member, because he's not going to keep his mouth shut. Yeah. And he's going to say, but.
Yeah. He'd be the eternal, if there's an opposite of a yes man, he'd be a no man, maybe, or a what if man. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. That's good. Well, listen, as we get ready to close off here, there's a quote near the very, very end of the book. He ends up, true to form, as we've already suggested, he's having a letter communication with somebody who is actually the son of somebody who was in the company of pastors from way, way back in the beginning. And there's this quote that he says, it's on page 315. I'm going to actually, when I release this, I'm also going to have a write-up with a bunch of different quotes and some other kind of thoughts on the book. So, but I'll end with this here. It says, being a pastor is unique across the spectrum of vocations. Not better, not privileged, not anything special, but unique in society as a whole. Also, but maybe not quite so much, unique in the company of the people of God. Not much transfers from other vocational roles to who we are and to what we do. And I think it's interesting that he definitely, once he did it, like once he became, as you already alluded to in the beginning, Pastor Pete, which is something that the kids in his little area called him. Once he became Pastor Pete, like he was Pastor Pete wherever he was, right? Like there was no time in his life where he wasn't a pastor. His parish changed. And so the people that he was dealing with and that he was pastoring changed, but somehow that he uses the word vocation more than profession, which is a subtle but real distinction. Somehow that vocation actually bled over into his identity. Not everybody becomes a clerk, or not everybody becomes a lawyer, right? Like there's some people who are able to disassociate their identity from what they do being different than who they are. But for him, there was this kind of synergy of pastor as who he was, which is it's an encouraging read, and it's a very, Can you show us the stack? I mean, if you can even lift it. I'm not sure how many times he was going to the gym. I mean, like this guy, like what a.
These are some of my favorites. I've got a whole shelf at home full of my. I don't even bring my Peterson books to the office. They got to keep them.
Gotta keep them
close at home.
Hermetically sealed, like Star Wars toys. Well, Steve, or Doctor, do you mind if I call you Steve? It's too late now.
Steve. Okay. I only make my older brother call me Doctor.
An incredible privilege to be able to have some time with you, as always, and just be able to talk with this book was really great. Thanks a lot for your time, buddy.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Much love.